Hello and welcome to EdSpace, where we discuss some of the week's top headlines with Mint's editor, Sukumar Ranganathan. Welcome to the show, Sukumar. One of the first, topics for discussion today are the changes in the telecom sector, right? There are some moves which have been announced by the government, including refarming of spectrum. How does this change, the game for the companies?
See, the first thing to remember is everything is still fluid, right? It's all still work in progress. The government hasn't decided one way or the other. What we do have at this point in time is some sense as the direction in which they're heading. To really understand this, I think we have to step back in time and look at what happened through the 90s and through the 2000s. The first batch of telecom companies that got licenses to operate were all companies that operated on the GSM technology platform. So people like Vodafone and what is now Vodafone. At that time it was something else, but Vodafone and Bharti and Idea. And again, what is now Idea? At that time it was something else. And they were given a certain amount of spectrum. This being the Indian government, I think there were all kinds of complications about this. So initially it was envisioned that they would get 6.2 megahertz of spectrum, which was called startup spectrum. But it wasn't available in all areas. So some of them got 4.4, some of them got 6.2, but all these early guys I think got 6.2. And this is startup spectrum. The rest of it, what is called contracted spectrum, right? Contracted spectrum is when you get a license, the government promises to give you some spectrum, and then to help you start, it gives you some spectrum. Now ideally the contracted spectrum and the startup spectrum should be the same.
Right.
But again, because of the way telecom policy is done in this country, it was decided that 4.4 would be the contracted spectrum and 6.2 would be the startup spectrum. And it's very messy, but that's the way things are. I don't think there's any easy way to explain this. Now, a lot of these companies grew very fast, and when they grew very fast, they needed more spectrum. Obviously, you have to service more people. You need more spectrum, and there was no clear spectrum policy. So based on an ad hoc policy, which was partially dependent on the number of subscribers you had and when you reached that number and all that, and the availability of spectrum was given to these companies. It was ad hoc, it was based on some metrics, it was done. In the wake of the 2G controversy, obviously the government wants to clean up the whole thing, and if you look at the new telecom policy, which seeks to be an all-encompassing sort of thing, it says we will clean up this whole thing and make people pay for spectrum, which is fair. Spectrum is a national resource. Now the thing is, how retrospectively can you make them pay? How much will you make them pay? How will you arrive at the price? What quantum will you make them pay for? And these are all the issues that are at stake. Now obviously it is in the interest of the telecom companies, especially the early telecom companies, Bharti, Vodafone and Idea, not to pay too much, right? Because it's not as if the sector is doing very well. Thanks to a surfeit of companies being given licenses to operate, and that again is the government's fault. I think the sector is a mess because financially not too many companies are very well off. A lot of them have debt on their books. Some of the debt is on account of their operations, and some of the debt is the kind of money they took on to fund their 3G plans, right? Because 3G, all of them bid huge sums, because I think the government's bidding mechanism was quite honestly a little faulty, so everyone ended up paying huge sums of money, so that debt is sitting on their books now. So it's not a very healthy sector. And then you had a controversy, which is the 2G controversy, as a result of which banks are very, very hesitant to lend to this sector. So it's not a healthy sector. Profitability is down. They're still making profits, but profitability is down. So these guys don't want to pay too much. The government obviously, it sees this as a way to bridge its fiscal deficit, so it wants to get as much money as it can. So there's a ministerial panel which is looking at it, and from our understanding what's happened this week, because the ministerial panel has taken, it's taken two decisions. It first took a decision and then it tweaked the decision a little bit more. The first decision is, yes, it will levy a retrospective fee on spectrum, but that fee will be from 2008 to 2012 and not before that, which is good. The base on which this will be calculated is 6.2 and not 4.4, and you'll have to pay a certain amount, and that amount is calculated by indexing it to the State Bank of India's prime lending rate. So these companies will end up having to pay a little bit more than they initially expected to pay. And then prospectively, which is from 2012 onwards, they will have to pay whatever the auction determined price, because the auctions are coming, right? The 2G spectrum that was seized from the 122 licenses involved in the 2G scam, that was cancelled because the Supreme Court said you have to cancel these licenses. That spectrum is being re-auctioned. In fact, today is the last day for
bidding
applications. Not the bidding. The bidding will happen afterwards. So depending on the auction determined price, these people will have to pay prospectively. The initial estimate was around 27,000 crores that would be paid by these companies, but my sense is now if you add the retrospective fee that they have to pay, which will be around 4,000, 5,000, around 33,000 crores is going to be paid by these guys. Significant sum of money. So this is with respect to spectrum charges. Then there's the other issue, which is refarming, which is even more complex. It's complex because it involves spectrum in the 900 megahertz. The government wants it back as and when these licenses expire, because this is ideal for fourth generation services, right? High-end data intensive services. Telcos are obviously hesitant to give it back because it's a very, very efficient spectrum. It's simple physics, the lower the frequency of the spectrum, and 900 is obviously lower than 1800, right? So the lower the frequency of the spectrum, the higher the ability of radio waves to reach distances and to pass through obstacles, which means they can cut through buildings, they can reach greater distances. So obviously 900 is a very, very preferred thing. In the rest of the world, it's a signaling frequency. Now, for whatever reason, this was the one that was given to companies in the beginning, in the 90s. And the government wants to take it back. And it says, instead of that, we'll give you frequency in 1800. The companies are saying, don't do this, because this will mean that we will have to invest significantly more, because you need more physical infrastructure if you're going to put down more base stations and everything else. So you have to do that. So it's not going to be particularly easy for them. They'll have to spend a lot more money, and various estimates, some spilling into tens of thousands of crores, have been given. The greater fear, and I think this is a little bit alarmist, but some of the telcos are saying, because we are going to have to shift from 900 to 1800, we may not be able to do it across the country if we have a pan-India presence. So there may be some parts where we decide not to do it, which means a blackout, and which means some customers will be left high and dry. Highly unlikely situation, and what the government will then do is that the 900 megahertz spectrum that it has got, it will re-auction. And any company which is serious about 4G, because there's a voice and data convergence that's anyway happening, companies will make money from data, they're not going to make money from voice. So if you're serious about telecom, you have to be serious about 4G services. So they can't afford not to bid. So the same companies which gave up the spectrum in some case, got 1800 spectrum in the 1800 band, will have to rebid for spectrum in the 900 band, which will be given to them as free spectrum. Which means, what it means is you have to pay for it, but free spectrum means you can use it for anything. You can use it not just for your 4G services, but you can also use it for voice. So this refarming bit, I think, is one of those very, very complex and completely unnecessary things. I think what the government is doing is, it's trying to go back in time and set a perfect policy in place ab initio, right, from the beginning, which is not how policy works, because telecom policy has evolved over the last 2 decades in this country. So if you want to apply a policy that you come up with today to decisions that were taken in the 90s and allotments that were taken in the 90s, there'll obviously be a lot of angst about it. I personally believe this is not how companies operate, right? This is not how business decisions are made. So that's where we are.
What does it mean for a consumer? Does this have implications for consumers as well, the people who own mobile?
Yeah, it means 2 things, right? The first thing, it means the end of choice. Because I think what all this is going to result in is, it's going to make the competition go away. We are in for a bout of consolidation in this space. There are very few telcos who have the wherewithal to sit through and sustain this. So maybe 3, maybe 4, right? Because the state-owned ones are as good as dead. BSNL is another Air India in the making. So I think that's one thing. And obviously, because of the first thing, it naturally follows that India's famed, for a long time in the 2000s, we used to say telecom tariffs which are as low as 2 cents a minute, lowest in the world and things like that. That's going to end. We are going to have to pay a significantly steeper prices for using these phones.
Staying in the corporate space, Tata Indian Hotels Company Limited, they've launched a bid for in partnership with two other groups for the Orient Express hotels. How do you look at this? Because I remember in the mid 2000s when Tata's was trying to launch a bid for Chorus or even JLR, there was a lot of negative reaction, especially given the fact that you have a European brand being taken over by an Indian company. How the whole thing is going to be brand. It's going to bring down the value of the brand.
In fact, the interesting thing is they even made a bid for for Orient Express in 2007,
Yeah.
and the bid was rebuffed
Yeah.
by Orient Express, which said, and the rebuff was a very strong rebuff because it said it literally said you guys don't know what it takes to run a luxury
Exactly.
hotel chain,
Yeah.
and we don't want to have any sort of partnership with you.
Yeah.
I think part of the rejection might have also been hubris on the part of that company or of the American company, simply because in 2007 their shares were trading at a peak,
Yeah.
right? October 2007, I think their shares touched a peak of around $65.
Yes.
And now they're around 80% of their peak. They're around $12. So obviously things have changed. The company hasn't fared too well during this economic crisis and the consequent slowdown that's happened. So they may be more willing. Another reason why I think they may be more willing now is because Tata does own Jaguar Land Rover, which is as luxury a brand as you can get, and they've done reasonably well with it. Now there's a nuance that we have to look at here, which is the fact that is it good for all parties concerned? Now, acquisitions per se may not necessarily be good for shareholders, because if you ask my personal view, which is borne out by the valuation of Chorus when it was acquired and its current valuation, I think it was extremely bad for shareholders, right? But I think it's been extremely bad for shareholders in the short term. Maybe it will be good for shareholders in the long term. I don't know. Jury is out on it. So far, it's not been a great acquisition for shareholders because the value of Chorus has really come down since then. But what it has done is it's given Tata's an entry into a value-added side of the business where they did not have a presence, where the margins are obviously higher, and in the long run, it may turn out to their advantage. So Orient Express, again, will give the company far more properties, will really give it a global footprint, because this is a chain that owns 50 luxury hotels all over the world. It has one in Venice, it has one in Machu Picchu in Peru, and in a lot of these places there are no new licenses for new properties being given out, because these are like places which have to be which have to stay as they are for reasons that have to do with conservation or heritage or something else. So they have to be as they are, so you don't get any new licenses for new properties. So it's an interesting play by the company. Tremendous aggression, right? Because one would have thought that you'd seen the end of one phase of significant acquisitive activity by the Tata Group, because of all the Indian groups, I think they've been the most aggressive in terms of acquisition. But clearly they're not done yet, right? And maybe this is the beginning of a new wave of acquisitions by this group.